Hey everyone. It's usually an off week here at Opinion Science, but I decided to post a special extra episode today. You may know that last week, on March 27th, Daniel Kahneman passed away at the age of 90. Kahneman was a titan in social science. He was responsible for some of the most important work in our field, so much so that he was the first person with a psych degree to win a Nobel Prize. He was awarded the Nobel in economics in 2002. You may also know him from his very popular book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Anyhow, it's a huge loss for the field, and it was lovely to see the outpouring of respect on social media last week. For me, it was wild because just last month we released this podcast series on behavioral economics that was years in the making. Kahneman, of course, was a central character in that story, and we were lucky to have interviewed him back in 2021 for the series. I'd spent many hours hearing his voice in my headphones over the last few months as I finished editing those episodes. And I only met him that one time on Zoom, but it was really special to be able to talk to him. I'm remembering, too, that I had this minor existential crisis in college where I started out at art school, but feeling like that wasn't really where I belonged. And I was reading these books about the psychology of decision-making. I thought it was super interesting. And I remember reading one book in particular as I was packing up and riding a Greyhound bus across the country as I left art school. And that book is what introduced me to prospect theory. Those books were planting these seeds for me that a degree in psychology was what I wanted to do. So anyone of a certain age in this business owes a lot to Kahneman. And I realized that he also played at least some role in my own decision to get into social psychology at that point in my life. So we talked to him for about an hour for this behavioral economics series, and the goal was just research for the series, getting some sound bites, that sort of thing. We didn't conduct the interview the way we would have if it was going to be the final product itself, like as an interview episode. But I listened back to it last week, and there are a bunch of great moments in there, so I wanted to share it. Fair warning, it gets pretty inside baseball from time to time, but if you're familiar with his work on heuristics and prospect theory and all that stuff, I think you'll enjoy this candid history of that work. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point you to our full series on behavioral economics called They Thought We Were Ridiculous, which will give a lot of the context around the things that we talked about in this interview. Anyhow, it seemed like a fitting tribute to share our full conversation with Danny Kahneman and highlight his kindness and sharpness as we're mourning such a loss in our field. I cleaned up the audio a little bit, but I've mostly left it alone. As a quick heads up, my collaborators on this behavioral economics series, Kurt Nelson and Tim Houlihan, were also on the call. Tim kept his mic off and just enjoyed watching the conversation unfold, and you'll hear from Kurt occasionally in the interview. So let's get to it and hear from the one and only Danny Kahneman. Just as a little bit of background, so we want to tell the story of behavioral economics across a handful of episodes of a podcast and sort of trace it back to what classic economic theory had been predicting for a long time, the work that you and Amos did, the work that Richard Thaler and a motley crew of economists and psychologists got up to in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then kind of looking at how it's being applied and this once kind of fringe movement, call it, is now just bread and butter economics and how people think about choice and to the point that governments are implementing it in how they do things. So that's the story we want to tell. So we want to get your input both on the work that you've done, but also the people you've worked with, the stories behind where these insights came from, and what the reactions to them were. Okay. So that's our goal coming into this. So I was kind of thinking we could start with the idea of heuristics, which my first question really is about what the state of heuristics was at the time you guys were working on them. Because like my intuitive history of heuristics pretty much starts with your guys' 1974 paper. But I don't know, was that an invention, the idea of a heuristic, or what was the status of it at the time?
Use of heuristic originated with us. So it is now sort of the link between heuristics and biases that's from the title of our 1974 paper. The notion of heuristic existed before, and as a shortcut to solving problems, and Herbert Simon had talked about heuristics as a general way of simplifying processes. But we spoke of heuristics in a much narrower way, as processes that you use, and our context was just probability and frequency when we started. And we really started with those two ideas of representativeness and availability, and sort of added anchoring later, but we never had a good theory of anchoring. And so, but it fitted. We sort of shoehorned it into that paper because it was clearly important, related, and so on. So that's really how the term began. It was, we were looking for a label for those, what you do instead of computing probability the way it ought to be done. What do you do instead? And much more recently, I've called that the substitution process. I mean, and I think it's a much more general process than what we had in mind then. So my view of heuristics as of like 2000, 2010 is really quite different from the original view. And I see representativeness and availability as a special case of the substitution mechanism that is much broader. But they are particularly interesting and particularly broad.
Yeah, I like the idea of substitution because it sort of reminds me of when you ask a politician a question and they say, I understand what you're asking. Here's the question I'm going to answer. Yeah. And it's sort of like that's what your brain is doing. Like, I know you want me to guess how many of these there are, but I'm going to tell you how many I can remember.
And I'm going to tell you that simply because that's what comes to my mind. I mean, the way we think of substitution, and that's the way we thought of representativeness and availability. And that was a departure from the usual use of heuristic. We thought of them as not deliberate, as unplanned. This is just something that happens to you, that instead you're asked a question about probability and you answer a question about similarity, but you think you have answered the correct question. So that's the difference between these heuristics. Polya, and I'm sure Polya didn't invent the notion of heuristics, but he certainly developed it. And what are the shortcuts to solve problems? But our heuristics are not deliberate, and in that sense, they are quite different from. They're different. For example, today, Gerd Gigerenzer uses the term heuristic, and he really means something else. I mean, I think he uses heuristics in the classic Simon sense, and it's just creating a lot of confusion that the same word is being used in different ways.
When you were working on this, did you have a heuristic that you kind of glommed on first, then expanded out beyond all of this? Or in thinking through this from the very beginning, did you always realize that there's going to be a plethora of these that is coming out and kind of looking at it from the broader picture?
Well, the idea of representativeness and availability has two ways of substituting easy questions for the question of probability or frequency, ways of estimating answers to those questions. That came to us immediately, and we just used the word heuristic. I'm not sure whether we used it before the 1974 paper. Maybe we did, but we certainly did not have in mind the other heuristics. We were talking of these particular heuristics applied to judgment under uncertainty. So we were not planning to go beyond judgment under uncertainty.
Kurt's question reminds me, I was reading the paper again this morning, and I was a little surprised at how much of the beginning is about representativeness. It sort of struck me as, oh, wow, this is like the big one. But for me, that's not the one that comes to mind first. And so I wondered, at the time, did you guys think that representativeness, that's the cool one, and there's these other ones? Was there a favorite at the time that seemed the most striking?
I think, well, we had representativeness and availability. I think I was rather more interested in representativeness. And because I had been interested in non-regressive prediction and in the prediction problem in general. And I think for us, availability was very important, but I don't know what you have in mind. Probably coming from, I can see why you would, coming from where you come, be focused on availability, I suppose. But yeah, it's true. For me, representativeness was always the more interesting one, but it turned out that more has been done with availability than with representativeness.
Yeah, I wondered if you had an insight in terms of like which of them took off in a way that you didn't expect that, oh, that one, that's the one that you paid attention to?
No, I mean, it's not, it is the most cited of our heuristics paper, of our specific papers, is availability, but the next one is on the psychology of prediction, which is all representativeness. The representativeness paper itself is further down the list.
I want to get a sense of how you arrived at what these heuristics were and how you tested them. So my impression is that a lot of this work was done when you guys were in Eugene, Oregon with Paul Slovic. Is that right or no?
No. A lot of it was done. I mean, Amos and I started, I think, in 1969. And we did the research. Now, we spent 72, 73 in Eugene, and that's when we wrote the papers and did some of the research. But most of the research and most of the thinking had been done earlier. And it was done some of the time. Amos was in Stanford, and I was doing the research in Israel. And then we both got together for that year in Eugene.
Yeah, I have to imagine that collaborating across that distance was a little different then than it is now.
It certainly was more complicated. We did a lot of thinking before he left, and we had the basic ideas. And I collected a lot of data on representativeness, actually, that year. The psychology of prediction was later.
Mm-hmm. So how do you remember the process of going about, because my impression and what you've said about this work before is that the impact of it is so tied to how clean the question is, right? How intuitive the right answer feels and how wrong that answer actually is in that context. So can you walk us through the process of like, what did it take to finally crystallize the perfect question to elicit that heuristic in action?
Well, we spent the day, our days talking and finding things very amusing and looking for irony in the way our own thinking went. So we were looking for questions that we would find it tempting to answer wrongly, and that was our heuristic for searching for heuristics, and we had that general idea, and then we were looking for examples, and the examples turned out to be quite neat. But the main thing that we had, which actually came from Walter Mischel, the main thing was what I've called the psychology of single questions. That is, I had been very impressed by Mischel, by a paper that I read that Mischel wrote, I think, in 1963, where he used single questions that he asked of children. Like, he was in Jamaica, I think, and he was asking children about, you can get this piece of candy now, or 2 pieces tomorrow, and that's just one question. And he had another one: there is a fairy that can make of you whatever you want to be, and if the answer was a profession or something related to achievement, that was scored 1, anything else was scored 0. And those 2 questions correlated with everything in sight. I mean, that's what impressed me. And so I really had wanted to to do the psychology of single questions and to look for single question that would encapsulate. Lee Ross had a nice phrase for that. He called that bottling phenomenon. And so that's what we were trying to do. We were looking for. And our first study was really, it was the law of small numbers that were the first thing we did. And because that was the first thing that came out of our collaboration. And representativeness came out of that. But the law of small numbers is a series of single questions, each of which makes a point, and they're really self-contained. So that was a good heuristic search. It turns out that was essential to the success of the enterprise, which was quite surprising. And that's because when we wrote the paper in Science, people outside the profession reading those questions could feel that this was working on them. They would not have believed it if we described it in the language of experiments, but we were using these questions as demonstrations. They had demonstration quality, many of them, especially, of course, the representativeness ones, but availability also. I mean, you could sense what is going on immediately. And that's really, I think that's the story of why this particular work had so much impact. It is an accident of the medium that we chose. If we had described the same phenomena as experiments without, I don't, it would have been a well-cited paper, but it would not have been nearly as important as it turned out to be.
I was just reading just to follow up on that for a second, Kurt, sorry. In the book, you tell the story about, is it Robin Dawes? Am I getting that name right? Can you relay that story about someone who should have known better getting caught in the act?
That was, I think I described in the book the experience. I was writing in Eugene, well, we were in Eugene. I was also writing a book called Attention and Effort. And so I was working very hard that year. And I put an all-nighter at the Oregon Research Institute. I don't know how that happened, actually. But, and my task was to come up, I came up with Tom W. I wrote Tom W. that night. And then the first person to arrive was Robin Dawes. And I asked him, well, Robin, answer that question. And then he read carefully, and then he had a sly smile, like somebody who solved the problem. And he said, computer scientist? And of course, that was the lure. That was the intended answer. And of course, Robin was an expert on base rates. So clearly, he was not using base rates, and he was completely aware of them. At that time, by the way, computer science was a very small department. We are talking, early 1971, 72. So that was counter base rate. I was looking for something that is counter base rate, and that's what computer science was in 1971.
Yeah, these days the base rate is probably pretty gigantic.
Much higher. Yeah.
You talked about finding that single question, and you also talked about how you and Amos had conversations. How when you were working with Amos, then how did you guys really hone in on a specific question and work back and forth on that question? Can you just tell us a little bit about how that working relationship was in?
We spent about, I would say, at least half a day together. And producing those questions and honing them. And then we did everything together. For the first few years, we actually were not working on the problem when we were alone. We only worked together. And so we wrote the questions together, and we wrote every word of every paper together. And it's hard to tell you, somebody had an idea and somebody responded to it, and who knows. it took many iterations, because if you think of the amount of time that we spent together, and we ended up with, I don't know, 12 questions or 20 questions, it's not a great deal of output.
I'm curious how you wrote every word of papers together. That's like what? What, you just sitting down just together,
Yeah.
one person at the keyboard and the
Yeah.
other person.
Yeah, exactly. At first, there was no keyboard, but when there was a keyboard, that's how we did
Right.
it. Yeah. And we would struggle literally. I mean, when we wrote the science paper, the one that's the heuristics on biases, that took us a year. I mean, I think almost was probably working on similarity at the time. I was working on other things, but together, this is basically what we did. And we would go to a particular place in Jerusalem and sit together for hours and, and do a few sentences a day.
Was there a go-to place that you would go
Yeah,
to work on this?
yeah,
Where did you go?
It's called the Van Leer Institute. It's a very nice place. And there was, and at the time, there was coffee ad lib and cookies. And we were great consumers of coffee and cookies. And it was a lovely place. We had an office there.
How many coffees and cookies would you estimate went into that paper?
A lot. A lot.
Can we go on to prospect theory? And I know obviously it came after the work on heuristics, but when you and Amos were working on prospect theory, what was your hope for that paper? I mean, did you think that it would have the impact that it ultimately had?
No, of course not. I mean, we didn't have, by that time, we started on prospect theory immediately after we finished the science paper. So that was in 1974. I mean, I remember we finished, we had done the judgment work. And I remember Amos saying, would you like to do decision making together? And I said, sure. And that's what we did. Now he had to teach me, because I was not a specialist in that area, and he was. He had written a text with Coombs and Dawes while still a graduate student on mathematical psychology, and there were chapters on decision theory. So he more or less brought me up to speed. I was never fully up to speed in the details, but we knew what we were trying to do, basically, and then we used the same method that we had used earlier. We were just talking about it, and gradually, sometimes on prospect theory, there were discrete insights that, there was an insight about changes. That the carriers of utility are not final states, but they're changes. So at the time, it was really very important in texts on decision making that you were considering final states. This is the way that bets were represented. And that's exactly the way they're represented in Bernoulli's 1738 paper. So how wealthy will you be if the ship sinks? How wealthy will you be if the ship gets to its destination? So the bet is described in terms of states of wealth. And I think in the process of learning, I thought this is completely insane, because they were actually there's a famous experiment by Soupes and Luce on utility theory, and they were asking questions of people about gambles on pennies, I mean, on literally negligible sums. And it was supposed to be the utility of money. And it was unclear what money was. And I remember trying to figure out, clearly the psychophysics of changes and the psychophysics of wealth are not the same. It's not the same psychophysics. And so that was, and I came unclear. I mean, it seemed so odd that I came and I asked Amos, what's going on? And he immediately saw that. Reflection he came up with was a discrete idea. He said, we'd been working on gains, everything on gains, which was the normal thing at the time. And Amos said, what would happen if we turned gains into losses? And we by then had a large collection of examples, and we saw that every single example reflected. So that was the discrete insight. And I don't remember how loss aversion came about, but that was also fairly, sharp thing. That loss aversion became pretty clear once we decided on changes. So it's changes or gains and losses, and then it becomes clear that people don't accept fair bets. So that suggests a loss aversion.
Mm-hmm. In the context of what you were just saying, I just want to point out, this is my favorite line in Thinking Fast and Slow. You said, I did not know enough about utility theory to be blinded by respect for it.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like what it was like actually seeing what these economists thought was true?
I mean, Amos was very respectful of the theory. I mean, he was a theorist at heart, and he really valued elegance, and everything he did was very elegant. It was a difference between us. We were quite different intellectually. So he had a lot of respect for the theory, and that was very important. So he was not going to give up anything of that theory quickly or easily. But, prospect theory was really very compelling, that this is, that clearly this cannot be true. I mean, the standard utility for wealth is not going to do it. And then I remember discovering that economists actually believed that stuff. I mean, I remember that as because they were in the building next door. And it seemed, that something that to a psychologist would look ridiculous was doctrine. And, that's what their theory was based on. But we were not thinking of changing economic theory. The objective of prospect theory was to account for everything that was known about very simple gambles. So prospect theory is restricted to gamble with at most two non-zero outcomes. And it turns out, which we didn't realize, that this is already too complicated, because in decision weights don't stay constant. So if you have a bet with two outcomes or a bet with three outcomes, it's not the same decision weights. And that we didn't see until much, much later. So, and it turns out that the axiomatic treatment of prospect theory, which was done in large part actually by a friend, by David Krantz, he and Amos did that together. I had very little to do with the axiomatic treatment. But the axiomatic treatment, I discovered later, when I did understand it, depended critically on decision weights remaining the same for gamble with two and with three outcomes. That was really built right into it. So that was our objective, was to understand and to have a crisp theory of those very simple gambles. It was audacious, but at the time quite normal to call that a theory of decision under risk, because simple gambles were really the fruit fly of decision theorists.
How did the economists of the day either accept or not accept from your memory? I mean, where did they take a stand on this? Because I'm pretty sure it's
well, it was accepted by Econometrica as which is a prestige journal, and the referees, one of whom was Richard Zeckhauser. The referees were very favorable to it. I mean, I think it was virtually without changes. But economists thought that the whole thing was ridiculous. And they also thought that the work on heuristics was ridiculous because they had they didn't think that everybody does everything right, but they thought that errors were random. That is, it's the idea that errors are systematic that violated their view of the world, because their view of the world was that people are rational plus random perturbation. And that, by the way, was the key insight of Dick Thaler. That's what Dick Thaler, when he read our paper, he describes it, I think, in his Misbehaving book. He read our paper, that's what struck him. Oh, errors are systematic. And that was the commonality, that we were the first, as it were, to be taken we were not taken seriously, but to be considered, because we were offering a systematic theory of family of errors.
It's funny, you mentioned Econometrica, and I had this impression where, as a psychologist, I don't know that journal, so I was like, wow, their first paper was in Science, and then prospect theory ended up in this no-name journal called Econometrica, and then later, like, oh, no, that was serious business.
Yeah, I mean, look, and a lot, the story of the field and of behavioral economics would have been very different if we'd submitted the same paper to Psychological Review. So it turned out that because no economist would have, they wouldn't look at Psychological Review. I mean, people were really in their silos, and economists really did not. So a few of them saw the Science paper, but the one in Econometrica, because of the prestige of the journal, that was taken relatively seriously. Now, I still remember those comments about how ridiculous it is to have a theory of error, a real theory of error, as if the only possible theory is a normative theory, is a theory of rationality, because that's what they knew. And that was a lot of the commentary about our work had that character.
What was the impetus to put it in the economic journal as opposed to the psychological?
It wasn't it's because it was the journals where classic papers in decision theory had appeared. It's a journal of theory.
So it was the decision science piece of it. I get it.
It was just because we had written a paper on decision theory, and it was clearly the best place to publish a paper on decision theory, and we felt it was a good one, but we didn't expect that it would have the impact it did.
I want to get to behavioral economics in a second, but my last but my last question on prospect theory is, do you have any recollection of where the name prospect theory came from?
Yeah, I do. So we had a version of the theory quite early, within half a year. It's called value theory, and that paper still exists somewhere. And that was the first name that we gave to it. And then we polished it for 3 years. And it's the polished version of prospect theory. But about 90% of the key ideas we had in the first 6 months. All the rest was polishing. And then prospect theory came when we were writing. And the idea was, and I still remember that conversation, although I don't remember who did what, but the idea was, this could be an important paper. And if it turns out to be an important paper, we want a distinctive name for it. And so prospect theory was just a distinctive name for a theory. But that really came because just in case it turns out to be important, we want it to be distinctive.
It's as good a reason as any.
Yeah.
I want to check your time just because we got a little late getting started.
I'm enjoying this, and we started late. I don't care. This for me is a conversation, and I like remembering those things.
Good, great. Well, speaking of memory lane, to think about behavioral economics, when we talked to Dick Thaler, he talked about your time walking the wilderness early on, where he sort of found some excuse to be in your vicinity.
Yeah.
What do you remember those walks and talks and what they were like?
Of course. I mean, he was much younger, but he was just super smart and very funny. And he and I were neighbors. I mean, I was at the center up the hill, Palo Alto, and he was just a little below me at the what's it called, an economic institute of some kind. And so we were neighbors, and we would spend a lot of time walking together. And it was, in a way, I mean, it wasn't like the collaboration with Amos, but it was very funny, because Dick is very funny, as was Amos. And you must know that Dick is funny. He always was. And so it was a joy. And we learned economics. I mean, also what Dick had, he had single questions. That is, if his classic paper, the 1980, the Positive Theory of the Consumer, is a gem, and it's full of gems, and each one of those is a single question that makes a point, or a single demonstration that makes a point. So we had the same intellectual style, and that's he came to that completely independently. I mean, this is not, but there was an affinity that was immediate. And then a really important event in the history of the field there was a meeting of the Cognitive Science Society in Rochester. And we were approached by Eric Warner, who at the time was the vice president of the Sloan Foundation. And we met him at a bar. I mean, he looked for us, and we had a drink together. And he said he wanted to put some money into bringing psychology and economics together. And I remember what the answer was. There were two. One, that this is not a project on which you can spend a lot of money honestly. I remember that phrase. And the other one was that you should not give that money to psychologists who want to reform economics. You should give that money, spend that money on economists who want to learn psychology. And so I think the very first grant was for Dick Thaler to spend a year with me in Vancouver. That was after Eric moved to be president of the Sage Foundation, and he had sort of discretionary money, and he put money into that. And I think that was one of the first grants, certainly the first grant in behavioral economics, was to Dick to spend a year with me. And that was an important year.
To go back to it was Casbus, right? Where you were, and then he was up the hill, right? That's what you said?
Yeah.
Do you remember meeting him? My impression is you just kind of showed up and said, I would love to talk to you.
Yeah, that's basically what happened. And, he was very charming, And it wasn't as important as it became later. I mean, it became very obvious later that he was the economist that you wanted to support. But I'm trying to time the conversation. I'm not sure whether I was consciously thinking of him when we had our conversation with Eric Warner, which was later, but he was clearly the best.
Did Amos join those conversations, those walks with you at any point?
No, I mean
wasn't he was still in town?
There were frequent. Oh yeah, I mean he was in the Department of Psychology, so he was further, but he would come often to the center, and the three of us would have many conversations. And I suppose the two of them had separate meetings. I mean, Dick spent more time with me, but.
Yeah, in terms of the anecdote about where the grant money should go, what do you see as sort of the ultimate relationship between psychology and economics? My impression is it's contentious, but then you talk to people and they go, "Nah, it's not that bad." What has been your experience as a psychologist who's really rolled in economic circles?
It's astonishingly quick, the adoption of behavior economics. I mean, we're talking, prospect theory is 1979, and people basically ignore it, except for a few quite important people, including Ken Arrow and several other Nobel laureates, future Nobel laureates. So, and then, then I think Rabin got the Clark Medal. That was the first thing, and I got the Nobel in quick succession. That was about 20 years, so that's extremely quick for the adoption of really a strange body of ideas. So I have nothing to complain about as in terms of the receptivity to our ideas. It was. And as always, it's not that we changed a lot of minds. I mean, what became important was that people knew in the field took that up. And so that was true for Dick. And that was true, I think, for others like Colin Kember and Joe Kloenstein, that from the start, they were on that side.
So what do you think it was that allowed that quick uptake? I mean, obviously, there's lots of branches that come off of, Amos was a mathematical psychologist, and that,
Well, it was a combination. That was a thing that worked together. So prospect theory, because it was econometrica, had a certain cachet. I mean, it made stuff respectable. There were some papers that Dick and I and Jack Netsch, we wrote a paper on fairness. I think that's our first paper that, to our extraordinary surprise, I mean, we're really flabbergasted that it was accepted by the American Economic Review, which is, and it, again, it happened, the editor happened to like it, so he sent it to the only two people in the profession who would accept it. I think that was a deliberate move. One of them was George Akerlof, and the other one, whose name I forget, had written something about markets that don't clear. So that was an important paper, but maybe I exaggerated, but I think the key to the acceptance of behavior economics was a column that Dick wrote in the Journal of Economic Perspective called Anomalies. And Hal Varian was the economist at Google, and he was editor he was one of the editors of the journal at the time. And I think Stiglitz was involved. They invited Dick to write those columns. And those columns were extraordinary. They were funny. They were about a series of phenomena that are absolutely demonstrably true and violate standard theory, every one of them. And they could be read by any economist, and all economists got the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And to my mind, that was it. And that's the key. That it was a combination of a massive amount of empirical support through the anomalies. I don't know. I don't remember misbehaving well enough. I think I may be putting more weight on this than Dick himself does, but that's my, I mean, it's clear that he said he did behavioral economics. But I think the reason that it was accepted was that he provided the empirical support through the columns, and there was some background of theoretical respectability for a theory that was an alternative. Because for economists, unlike psychologists, you really need a theory. I mean, they're much more serious about theory than psychologists are. And so having a theory in the background was quite helpful.
Yeah, it's funny. When I don't get the sense that Thaler puts much weight on anomalies, but when I talked to Colin Kammerer, he identified anomalies as a super important component too. So I think everyone around him points to anomalies as like the inflection point.
I think it clearly was.
What do you think brought it into the popular arena, right? I mean, again, most theories, most research is kind of stuck in academia. Behavioral economics seems to have expanded beyond that. Do you have any thoughts around how it got into the popular press?
I mean, it's actually quite ironic. I mean, one of the operations of the Sloan Foundation was a summer camp, and the first year that we had the summer camp, we had young economists, graduate students, or young PhDs, and some psychologists. Craig Fox was a psychology student, and I remember he was in that first group. And I think David Leibson probably was as well. I mean, it was quite a good set of people. But the second year, so Dick and I, and I think Colin was with us, probably. There were three of us, but I think Dick and I were the senior ones the first year. And the second year, Dick refused to accept anybody but economists. And I was annoyed, and we had conversations about this. And he explained that he didn't want behavioral economics to be a hybrid field. He wanted it to be an approach to economics. So he was completely strategic about this. And he was absolutely right. So that the fact that it was an approach to economics rather than a bastard field, that helped a lot.
Do you see yourself as a behavioral economist?
Well, I mean, the irony of this is that Dick was insisting that only an economist can be a behavioral economist. And he really made life miserable to psychologists who wanted to call themselves behavioral economists. But then he and Cass published Nudge, which was what actually made behavioral economics public. And Nudge, I mean, Dick doesn't like when I say so, but Nudge is social psychology. I mean, it doesn't have all that much economics. So in the end, it was Dick who turned behavioral, who sort of took applied social psychology and turned it into behavioral economics, because that's basically what it is. It's the part that's appealing to the public, Nudges, that's social psychology, I mean, clearly. And, Cialdini should be a father of behavioral economics, and he's considered as such. And so now social psychologists who want to do applied work have to call themselves behavioral economists. So that's the ultimate irony, because that was not what Dick had in mind to begin with, but in the end, that's what it turned out to be.
How would you define behavioral economics then? So we're doing a series on behavioral economics. I have personally always found it a slippery term in terms of, because like you said, it's been conflated with these other things. But to you, when you say this is behavioral economics, right, at its heart, it's really restricted to this stuff. What would you say that is?
I would say that people who view Dick Thaler as their guru, uh, that's behavioral economics, so pretty much. And because that includes many social psychologists, that includes everybody who is interested in nudging, uh, and and the thing that were intellectually important to Dick, including prospect theory, and that's in the background. But it was really quite personal because there were many people. I think the term existed, behavior economics, and there were many people who called themselves behavior economics. So it was but it ended up. I could think of several names, but I don't think so.
So where did the name come from? So you said, did you just co-op it?
I think it existed. I'm trying to remember who it was. There was an Israeli economist who was quite prominent in that, and there were quite a few people when the term began to be used. There were quite a few people. I remember Bob Sugden and economists, Graham Looms in the UK, who really felt they were behavioral economists, but they were not disciples of Dick Thaler. And in the end, the way that it's mostly defined, they still consider themselves behavioral economists, but that's not the definition of the field.
It's funny, we have asked this question to so many people, and everybody goes, I don't know, I think it was this, and it's always a different. It's just funny that name that is stuck, it's like stuck so well. It's been, I think it's been very, part of the success.
It's a very good label. It should be called behavioral science or applied behavioral science. The way it's turned out, that is not just being the core of it. But behavioral economics also has a research, and that includes behavioral finance, which is completely different. And there are behavioral approaches to other things. But there are many people who do sort of work that would be considered behavioral, but who do not insist that they do not. Call themselves behavioral economists. So Raj Chetty is a shining example. So Raj Chetty, who, I don't know if he's still at Stanford, maybe he's at Harvard already, but he is a brilliant economist, absolutely brilliant, who got the Clark Medal very young then. And Dick Thaler, when he was president of the AEA, picked Raj Chetty to give the Eli lecture, which is a prerogative of the president, and it's a highly prestigious lecture. And Raj Chetty keeps discovering phenomena that don't fit the classical theory. But he certainly doesn't call himself a behavioral economist. And that would be true of John List, that would be true of several other economists, Steve Levitt, they might, they wouldn't be offended. I mean, today it's not an insult to call somebody a behavioral economist. But at some point, it would have been.
Do you get the sense that classic economics is dead in the water, or is it still hanging on? Yeah.
No, I mean, the behavioral economics is a minority movement. I mean, it's not in the textbooks. So the introductory textbooks, I think there may be one, and it was written by sympathizers, by, I think, Bob Frank, certainly. I think he has an introductory text. But the major introductory text, the Mankiw, I think doesn't mention it. Or at least the first edition certainly did.
So where do you see things going? If this is the state of it, what's around the corner?
I have absolutely no idea. I don't think that forecasting the developments is a useful enterprise. I mean, the only people who know something about it are the young people who are starting their career, because they're going to make the next 10 or 15 years. So the thing they're interested in, that's the future that can be seen. I don't think anybody can see beyond that, and I don't know what they're like.
Is there somebody that you think hasn't gotten enough kind of recognition from some of the early work, and even going before you mentioned, Herb Simon early on, but others?
Well, I mean, Jack Knetsch, who collaborated with Dick and me in a couple of important papers on fairness and on the endowment effect, he is widely ignored and very important. I mean, he had independent studies of the endowment effect, and he and I worked together on contingent valuation, which was a contribution of economics to public policy, and I think completely crazy. So Jack Knetsch hasn't got the credit it deserves. I'm sure there are many others.
Okay, can I ask a little bit about Thinking Fast and Slow, the book? So I would say that it was I would call it a runaway success in that it just seems like it got picked up and influenced so many people and was sort of the gateway into this world for so much of the public. But why did you write it in the first place? Why did it feel like, yep, this is because it's a big book and it had to have taken quite an effort to put together.
It's been more than 7 million copies have been sold worldwide. So it's a big, completely mysterious why to me. I think somebody, told me you ought to write a book or something. And then but I knew that I couldn't write a book because I'm just too conflicted and I write too slowly. And so I thought maybe I could get somebody to write it for me. And it started out as a collaboration with Jason Zweig, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, and we worked together. And then it turned out he couldn't write in my voice, and so we couldn't, and I ended up writing it alone, very painfully. Why? I had been teaching. I mean, every chapter there comes either from a lecture that I had given or from something I had taught, as a discrete topic. And it turned out that I had a lot of stories to tell by that stage. But I didn't like the book, when I thought I certainly did not anticipate that it would be successful, because I was trying to write simultaneously for two audiences. I mean, I wanted to be taken seriously by professionals and to be readable by the public. And I didn't think that I thought I would fail clearly with one or with the other. And turned out I did all right.
You definitely did all right. The idea to frame System 1 and System 2 as characters, that's a very narrative flair, and I'm wondering where that came from.
Well, I mean, that's, I explained it in the book. I mean, it clearly, endowing them with personalities is clearly the way to go, because we think so much more easily about agents than about categories. That is just a very natural. Agents have characters, they have traits, they have impulses, they move, they do things. Categories are dead. And there's a very similar thing I heard when the book came out. I think with Jonathan Ferr, no, maybe not Jonathan, one of the Ferr brothers, F-O-E-R, had a book on Moonwalk with Einstein, I think it was called, on mnemonics, on the Greek and Roman mnemonics, and the idea when you're trying to remember a list, you you go through the house and you drop the elements of the list at different places. And the idea, it's the same idea. People can remember routes, paths, much more than they can remember lists. So lists are dead, but when you think of it as an activity, as a sequential activity, it's become much easier to deal with. So it was clear that was the way to go didactically. And frankly, I think better when I think that way. I can translate, I know, and some people are deeply offended by this idea. But I think it's ridiculous to be offended because you always can translate. And I really, it's true that many people believe that they exist and that they exist in the brain and they're localized and that's misleading. But I think that if people understand the systems and are misled about their place in the brain, I think it's a net gain.
Yeah, there's a fierce debate between dual systems and dual process. As a petty alum, it's like, no, there are not two systems. They are not discrete. And for a little while, that's what I was resistant to the book. I was like, oh, that's some of that dual system stuff. But I quickly, in reading it, realized it's a narrative device, right? It itself is a heuristic for conveying this information.
Absolutely. And I said that. I mean, it was clear that you want to talk about type 1 and type 2, but it's also clear that you killed you make it harder to think. It's just so much easier to think when you think you have two interacting systems, rather than when you have lists of mental activities that fall uneasily into one class or another.
Can you tell us a little bit? So part of what we want to get is the people who obviously have informed and been at the forefront of this. And so we talked with Dick Thaler and asked him, describe you and describe Amos. And so we're going to ask the same that you get to, how would you describe Dick Thaler? What would you say he is like?
I mean, I think of him as a genius. I mean, I think he's just extraordinary. And he has a flair and a sense for what's important. I mean, we have that running joke that I call him lazy, and he doesn't spend any time on things that do not matter. I mean, he doesn't get distracted by things that do not matter. He's very wise, and he has both irony and wisdom, and that's a very powerful combination.
Great. And then any final thoughts? Any things that you would say people get this wrong about?
I said plenty. I think you got more than you were asking for.
Yeah, we got plenty. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure.
This was really wonderful to talk to you.
Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
All right, that's it for this special extra episode of Opinion Science. We are so grateful to Danny Kahneman for agreeing to talk with us a couple of years ago. His warmth, intellect, and influence will be missed. I'll be back next week on schedule to share one last full interview from our behavioral economics series. Be sure to subscribe to Opinion Science anywhere you get podcasts to stay in the loop, and check out the podcast webpage for more, opinionsciencepodcast.com. And as it turns out, the person we're going to hear from next week, David Halpern, also owes a lot to Kahneman in building a behavioral economics unit in the British government. And of course, if you haven't already listened to our full series, They Thought We Were Ridiculous, which came out last month, it's the story of behavioral economics and includes Kahneman's voice among many, many others to tell this story of a movement that changed how economists think about decision making. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.